And we're going to hear from Anna Kerr from Australia. She's the Women's Human Rights Campaign country contact from Australia. She's from the Feminist Legal Clinic, and she is going to talk to us about what's happening in Australia and any other news she has. Over to you, Anna.
Well, hello everyone from Feminist Legal Clinic here in Australia, where we've recently been exiled by the City of Sydney Council. I'm going to be talking today about my experiences as the Principal Solicitor of Feminist Legal Clinic. We're a community legal service which provides domestic violence advocacy services and also runs human rights cases on behalf of women and girls. We assist and support women who could really benefit from the protections set out in the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. I can't always talk in much detail about individual cases due to client confidentiality, in some cases court orders, but I think you'll see when I go through what we've been doing that the need for each article of the Declaration is very obvious in the work that we do. Okay, so Article 1, obviously this article is really the crux to all of the articles. Women's rights must be based on sex because there is no rational alternative. And this is demonstrated by some of these really bizarre new laws, such as this one I've got here, a section from the Tasmanian Births, Deaths and Marriages Act, which has replaced sex with gender, which is now defined to include male or female or indeterminate gender or non-binary, or a word or phrase that is used to indicate a person's perception of the person's self as being neither entirely male nor entirely female, and then they repeat that again, so it's either prescribed or not prescribed. So this is the kind of brilliant legislation they're coming up with. I don't know if you're confused yet, I certainly am. This kind of legislation creates, however, wonderful opportunities for satire, and we already have many individuals claiming to identify as attack helicopters, and indeed, why not? Moving on to Article 2, motherhood, female status. As a mother of 4 children, I've spent a large part of my life gestating and lactating, and I am aware that there are some things men just can't do. And so while I'm happy to agree that a man can and should be put to equal use with a brush and pan and many other menial domestic chores, I'm not so comfortable with extending this argument to its full extent with babies, as perhaps suggested by this image taken from an article by a liberal feminist. For example, the next image on this slide is of a publication recently released by the Australian Breastfeeding Association, and it talks in terms of pregnant people, lactating parents, and chest feeding, and generally does its best to convey the impression that men can do it too. I think we all know that's not true. Feminists, and otherwise some of the so-called men, of course, are indeed women. Feminist Legal Clinic has been involved in supporting several breastfeeding counsellors who have been bullied and disciplined for resisting this new language and all it implies. However, it does seem that the $20,000 paid to the Australian breastfeeding by Rainbow Family resulted in them losing all grasp of reality. So Article 2 is also close to my heart because of the work that we do coordinating a domestic violence support service in the Sydney Family Court. Recently released research has revealed that only 14% of child sexual abuse allegations are believed by family court judges. And unfortunately for many women, they are instead accused of engaging in parental alienation and coaching their children to make false claims. And they then risk having their children removed from them altogether in some cases and placed with the alleged perpetrator more of the time. This is all facilitated by a narrative that women are malicious, liars or delusional. And this is kind of summed up in the last witty image designed by a men's rights activist. All of this completely ignores the reality that we are experiencing an epidemic of child sexual abuse and that males are overwhelmingly the perpetrators of this. And this also disregards the very essential safeguarding role played by mothers. And I think unless we get some change in laws, this is going to continue to happen. Now, Article 3, this focuses on physical and reproductive integrity. Again, there's a narrative that men can mother as well, if not better than women, and this has enabled the gay male adoption and surrogacy industries to flourish in recent years. The callous commodification of women and children is enabled by rampant capitalism, which determines that the best interests of the child can be decided on economic criteria, effectively equating the capacity to parent with the capacity to pay. Surrogacy arrangements prioritise contractual obligations over human rights and ignore the trauma and risk to a child inherent in removal from its mother. Members of our management committee, one in particular is a convener of the adoption rights activists in Australia. So this is another area where we are active. Despite the notorious Australian cases, several of them that have been in the news, of babies being purchased specifically for use by pedophiles, there continues to be extensive favourable coverage of surrogacy in the media, and Australian couples are some of the major customers of surrogacy services internationally. Few Australians are aware of the fact that Peter Truong and Mark Newton, pictured here, are now serving 30 and 40-year prison terms in United States jails as a result of what they did to this child purchased from a Russian mother. The fact that commercial surrogacy continues to be illegal within Australia does not prevent these atrocities from being committed. In 2017, when I raised concerns with surrogacy while the chair of a women's subcommittee in an association of Australian human rights lawyers, I was told that these concerns were incompatible with the rights of gay men. Shortly afterwards, I was anyhow ejected from the group for questioning trans ideology. So safeguarding women and children doesn't seem to be ever prioritised over the feelings of men, even in human rights groups. The other thing that's happened is we put a lot of effort in 2017 to pass a bill to decriminalise abortion in New South Wales. We weren't successful that year. It was the same year, of course, that same-sex marriage received a lot of attention, and it certainly did pass. But 2 years later, in 2019, the women's sector finally did throw its support behind a similar bill, but it was this time being spearheaded by a gay male politician, that's Alex Greenwich, who's pictured here. But this time the legislation omitted the words mother or woman. That same campaign alliance also forcibly ejected Feminist Legal Clinic, again, because they regarded us as transphobic due to content on our website, which really is just news reports. Now, Alex Greenwich has gone on now to introduce a motion to the New South Wales Parliament calling for further reforms to strengthen trans rights, and this was passed by consensus by the New South Wales Parliament with vocal support from all major parties. So I think we all know what's going to come next. Article 4. So in terms of our casework, one of our longest running matters has been the transgender vilification case brought by Bridget Clinch against one of our clients, Beth Rep. This case relates to gender-critical social media posts by Beth, and this is a photo of Bridget Clinch, who was actually the first member of the military to transition while serving, and he was instrumental in getting the Australian Defence Force to change their policy in this area. Aside from trans activism, Clinch has also been active seeking apologies for the hurt feelings of commandos charged over the killing of children in Afghanistan. He's also run as a political candidate for both the Veterans Party and the Queensland Greens. Unfortunately, due to non-publication orders made by the tribunal, there's been limited coverage of the case. The tribunal ultimately held our client liable not only for their own social media posts, but for all the comments posted by third parties in response. And Beth was ordered to pay Clinch $10,000 in compensation. Such a decision has far-reaching consequences for all Australian gender-critical feminists who use social media to express themselves. We have, of course, appealed this decision, but we've been waiting now for the outcome of that appeal since the 2nd of March this year. So watch this space. Some of the other women who have contacted us for support, just to give you examples of the kind of women who are being silenced, there was a social worker whose employment was threatened because she expressed agreement with J.K. Rowling in a staff meeting. We had an Indigenous woman working in child protection who was sacked for questioning implications for child safety during a training session. We've had a number of academics and students who've been subject to complaints and disciplinary proceedings for expressing views in this area. And we've had quite a variety of health professionals who've been required to answer complaints made against them to the Healthcare Complaints Commission and other similar professional bodies. And of course, most recently, our own service has come under fire with our landlord, the City of Sydney Council, terminating our tenancy, citing material on our website that they felt might offend members of the trans community. They also cited our affiliation with this organisation, which they referred to as the Women's Sex-Based Rights Movement. Despite many letters and hundreds of signatures sent to the council in support of our service, we have indeed now been evicted. Looking at Article 5, Peaceful Assembly and Association, one case is that of McIver's Ladies Pool in Sydney, which has come under extensive pressure to accept males who claim to be women as patrons. There was a lot of press coverage of this earlier on. These natural seawater pools were a sacred birthing place for Indigenous women prior to colonisation, and they've continued to be a sanctuary for women uncomfortable under the male gaze, including Muslim women and Orthodox Jewish women who are constrained by their religious beliefs from swimming elsewhere, as well as many lesbian women who use the pool. There have been past attempts by men to seek access to the pool, but these were successfully defended, and the pool was granted an exemption from sex discrimination laws some years ago. However, that was before New South Wales introduced the laws on transgender discrimination, so we will have to wait and see how things pan out now. Regardless of the laws, in practice, many exclusively female spaces, groups and services are folding under the pressure to accept males who claim to be women. One example, as a picture there, is of a long-standing lesbian social group who did its best to be inclusive, only to find that its numbers silently plummeted from about 60 a week down to a mere dozen. But they still had no grounds to exclude males who claimed to be lesbians, despite the fact that they were clearly making many other attendees uncomfortable. Eventually, there was an act of violence and a woman was seriously assaulted and the police were called. And the act of violence was by a male who was claiming to be a lesbian. Now there were grounds to exclude, of course, the offending individual. But the organisers at that stage were then too afraid to continue meeting because they were worried about reprisals of some sort. And so the group folded anyhow after 16 years of operation. Most recently, we've got a case of a Tasmanian woman who requested an exemption from discrimination legislation so that she could hold a lesbian drag king event. And the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Commissioner refused that exemption. And so we're representing her in the tribunal in relation to that matter. Article 6, political participation. The first picture here is of a political candidate who was also elected as convener of the New South Wales Greens Women's Working Group, to gushing acclaim by many women clearly keen to demonstrate their progressive credentials, while many other women silently unsubscribed from the mailing list. Michaela was embraced as a woman despite not having undergone any surgical intervention due to fragile health. Michaela also maintained a male persona for business purposes. However, any concerns expressed about her Michaela's lack of lived experience as a woman were strongly repelled as unsafe, particularly in view of Michaela's fragile medical condition. The second picture is of Divi Devondra, who was the founder and lead Senate candidate for the Women's Party in 2019, the Australian federal election. Divi had had 3 wives and 3 children and was aged over 70 before deciding to have surgery and claimed to be a woman. I had immense difficulty getting the Australian media to publish about this, as they were concerned that letting the public know that the Women's Party was in fact set up and run by a male might offend the trans community. They were far less concerned about women's feelings. The final picture in the corner is of me speaking at Australia's Report to CEDAW in Geneva in 2018. It was not my plan at that time to raise trans issues, but I did feel compelled to speak up at a meeting that was held in advance of the session to oppose the inclusion of self-declaration of sex in a consensus statement being prepared on behalf of Australian NGO delegates. I merely made the statement that there was no consensus on this point. This resulted in extensive repercussions for me once back in Australia, with 5 organisations making complaints against me. Aside from causing Feminist Legal Clinic to almost fold under the stress, there were sustained efforts for the next 2 years to have me removed from other elected positions on women's groups. So yes, political participation, definitely feeling the impact there. This one, women's sport, Article 7. This is a picture of Holly Conroy, who's hailed as the driving force behind the first ever Pride Parade in the conservative regional town of Wagga Wagga. Conroy featured in an SBS documentary which followed him through his surgeries in Thailand, as well as organising this event. Conroy works as a truck driver and was also nominated as a finalist for Regional Woman of the Year. The influence of such celebrity status in a country town should not be underestimated. As you can see, Conroy also likes to play soccer, but other women playing would be well advised to take care calling man on. I can't really go into more details, but just want to say that regional sporting tribunals are operated by members with very little grasp of the rules of procedural fairness and natural justice. Furthermore, ACON, which is to some extent our equivalent of Stonewall in the United Kingdom, does not appear to have qualms meddling in the functioning of sporting tribunals. Safety and fairness in women's sport is being compromised not only at the Olympic level, but also in grassroots amateur club sport. And indeed, there's even less protection for women at this level. Many women choose to stop playing rather than put their safety at risk playing against an aggressive male. I'm doing okay for time. This, in my view, feminism is about the liberation of women from male oppression and violence, and we need it as much as ever. Feminism is not about ignoring real differences that exist between men and women. Services like ours struggle to keep women and children safe, and we certainly can't do this if the word woman has lost all its meaning. So our domestic violence advocacy work is now under threat because New South Wales Legal Aid is using our eviction by the council as a basis for threatening to remove us from all legal aid panels, court rosters, and reassigning all my existing cases. So I'm in the process of obtaining legal advice on this. So I won't go into any further detail other than to say, again, men's feelings take priority over women's safety. That's a photo. One of the photos is of us packing up the office, but the other photo is of the protesters at the event at the University of Sydney, which we helped organise, where we were going to have we did have a detransitioner talk about the harms caused by extreme trans ideology. And it was complaints following this event that put in train the termination of our tenancy by the City of Sydney Council. Article 9, about children. Look, before the COVID lockdown, our service was hosting meetings of a support group for parents where they shared distressing stories of how their children had manifested rapid onset gender dysphoria and were being fast-tracked onto hormones and surgeries to their parents' horror. Aside from support for parents, we also assist detransitioners and help put them in touch with suitable and willing medical negligence lawyers with access to much needed litigation funding. For example, one of our clients who's been placed on hormones, which were quickly followed by a complete mastectomy and hysterectomy following just a single session with a psychiatrist, is hopefully, we should see some litigation commence shortly. There are other efforts in Australia to organise a class action. In the recent case of Imogen in the Australian Family Court, the court did clarify that it is necessary if either parent does not consent to the medical treatment of their child to seek court approval. Although treatment was ultimately approved for the child in this case, the decision at least resulted in significant improvement in that the ACON, who runs the Trans Hub, had to remove from their website advice to children over 16 that they could proceed on to more hormones without their parents' consent. And I think part of the reason for that decision was no doubt because the judge received submissions from an intervening party referring to Article 9 of this Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights and other evidence of mounting international concern about the harm to children by unfettered gender ideology. I like to think that this decision may have saved at least some children from embarking on harmful treatment. So just like to conclude that Feminist Legal Clinic is a not-for-profit charity operated by volunteers and funded entirely by the generosity of our members and supporters. Until recently, we did have a free office, but that is no more. So please continue to support us and consider joining as a member of our service. Thank you.